The station's threat board had been amber for 11 hours when the Malinois sat down in the corridor and refused to move. Cade Morrow noticed because Juno never refused anything. 4 years of deployment across 3 systems, and the dog had walked through plasma fires, decompression klaxons, and a hull breach that sucked a cargo pallet into the dark. She had walked through all of it at heel, ears forward, breathing through her nose like the universe was a mildly interesting hallway. She did not sit down in corridors. She did not plant her hindquarters on the cold deck plates and stare at a sealed bulkhead like it owed her something. He stopped, looked down at her, looked at the bulkhead. "Juno with me." She did not move. The corridor was empty. Third watch on Relay Station Keth 4 meant skeleton crew, and the skeleton was mostly Torvathi administrative staff who kept their own hours in their own wing. The human contingent was small. Cade, his dog, a logistics officer named Pell who slept 14 hours a day, and a communications tech who had rotated in last week and whose name Cade kept forgetting. That was it. That was Earth's entire presence on a station that housed 430 Torvathi bureaucrats, a rotating delegation of trade envoys, and enough paperwork to fill a gas giant. Cade's assignment was officially security liaison. Unofficially, he was the coalition's way of putting a human near the Torvathi border without making it look like a statement. One handler, one dog. A uniform with no rank insignia visible and a bunk in the service wing. Low profile, low temperature. The kind of posting you gave someone who was very good at his job and very bad at talking to generals. He crouched beside Juno. Her ears were up and forward, locked on the bulkhead. Her breathing was steady. No whine, no growl, nothing in her posture that read as fear. She was reading something behind that door, and whatever it was had tripped a wire in her head that 4 years of combat deployment had never tripped. She was telling him no. Cade put his hand on the back of her neck. Her fur was warm and coarse under his palm, the muscles beneath it perfectly still. He felt her pulse through his fingertips, slow, even. The pulse of a predator that had already made its assessment. "All right," he said quietly, "show me." He keyed the bulkhead open. The room beyond was a secondary storage bay, half-lit, stacked with crated supplies and decommissioned environmental filters. It smelled like ozone and Torvathi packing resin. Juno walked in ahead of him, which she never did, and stopped 3 meters inside. She lowered her head and her tail went still. Not tucked. Not wagging, still like a compass needle that had found north. Cade followed her gaze. In the far corner between 2 stacks of filter housings, a Torvathi child was curled on the floor. He knew it was a child because of the size. Torvathi adults stood nearly 2 meters tall, built like upright monitor lizards with longer limbs and broader skulls, slate-gray scaling that darkened to charcoal at the joints. This one was small enough to fit in Cade's arms. Its scales were pale, almost silver, the way Torvathi children's scales were before they darkened with age. Its eyes were closed. Its breathing was wrong. Cade crossed the room in 4 strides. He knelt beside the child and put 2 fingers against the side of its neck, where the major vessel ran close to the surface in Torvathi physiology. The pulse was rapid and thin, fluttering against his fingers like something trying to escape. "Hey," he said, "can you hear me?" The child's eyes opened, vertical pupils amber, wide with something that wasn't quite fear. Confusion, maybe. Pain. Its mouth opened, and a sound came out that was closer to a hiss than words. Its left arm was pressed against its torso at an angle that no arm should hold. Cade looked at Juno. The dog had moved closer, and she was doing the thing he had never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't seen it. She was being still. Not standing still, which was a different thing. Being still the way a mountain is still, the way deep water is still. Every line of her body communicated a single message to every nervous system in the room. Nothing will happen here that I do not allow. The child looked at Juno, its rapid breathing slowed by 1 increment. Good girl, Cade said, and he did not mean the child. He activated his comm. Pell, I need you in secondary storage, Bay 7. Bring the field kit. Pell's voice came back thick with sleep. It's third watch, Morrow. Torvathi juvenile, injured, possible fracture to the left forelimb. Get up. Silence, then, moving. Cade turned back to the child. He kept his voice low, his movements slow. I'm going to look at your arm. I'm not going to touch it yet. Okay. The child stared at him. Then its gaze drifted back to Juno, who had lowered herself to the floor and laid her chin on her paws, 6 inches from the child's good hand. The child's fingers twitched, reached, touched the bridge of Juno's nose. Juno did not move. The child's breathing slowed another increment. Cade examined the arm without touching it. The scaling was discolored around the joint, swollen, the plates pushed apart by inflammation beneath. Not a clean break. Something had wrenched this arm hard enough to separate the joint and stress the bone. This was not an accident. Children did not fall off things and produce this kind of injury. This was a grip hand twist. Someone had done this. He filed that away in the part of his brain that was already running a cold, quiet process. He would address it. Not now. Now there was a child on the floor. Pell arrived with the field kit, took one look at the situation, and woke up completely. She was a competent medic when she wasn't sleeping. Between them, they stabilized the arm with a compression splint from the human kit, adjusted for scale density using a padding technique Cade had learned on a joint deployment with Torvathi Marines 3 years ago. The child hissed when they moved the arm into position, but did not scream. Its free hand stayed on Juno's nose the entire time. We need to report this to station administration, Pell said, keeping her voice neutral. Torvathi child, unaccompanied, injured. That's a Torvathi internal matter. I know what it is, Cade said. Morrow. I know. He looked at the child. The child looked at Juno. Juno looked at Cade with her calm, amber eyes, and her slow tailbeat thumped once against the deck, and that was the entire conversation. Cade carried the child to the human wing. Pell walked ahead. Juno walked at heel beside him, and the child weighed almost nothing in his arms. He could feel its heartbeat through the thin scaling of its chest, faster than a human child's would have been, but steadying. The corridors were empty. The station's environmental systems hummed their low, constant note, and the overhead lighting was dimmed to third watch amber, and Cade's boots made the only sound on the deck plates except for the click of Juno's nails. He put the child on his bunk, which was the only surface in the human wing that was clean and horizontal, and not a desk covered in logistics manifests. Juno jumped up beside the child without being told and laid herself along its side, a 30-kilogram wall of warm fur and slow breathing. The child's good hand found her ear and held on. Pell watched from the doorway. You know what happens when a coalition liaison takes custody of a delegate's child. I haven't taken custody. I've provided first aid and a bed. The distinction won't matter to the delegate. The distinction matters to me. Pell looked at the child gripping the dog's ear, at the dog's calm eyes, at the splinted arm. She shook her head but said nothing else. She left the field kit on the desk and went back to her quarters. Cade heard her footsteps recede down the corridor, and then it was just him and the child and the dog, and the station turning slowly in the dark. Cade reported to station administration at 400. The Torvathi duty officer was a mid-rank bureaucrat named Selthan Vor, who had the coloring and bearing of someone who had spent their entire career in climate-controlled offices. His scales were the uniform gray of desk work. His pupils contracted when Cade described the child's injuries. A juvenile, Vor said, in the storage bays. Bay 7, left forelimb wrenched at the joint, that's not a fall. Vor's head tilted. The Torvathi tell for discomfort. You are making an assertion about causation, liaison Morrow. I'm making an observation about anatomy. Torvathi elbow joints don't separate like that from impact. They separate from torsion. Someone twisted that child's arm until it broke. Vor was quiet for a long time. Behind him, the administration office hummed with the passive glow of data terminals and filing arrays, the machinery of bureaucracy that ran whether anyone watched it or not. Then he said, "The child belongs to Delegate Reth Sorath." Cade waited. Delegate Sorath chairs the Keth 4 Trade Commission. His household is a matter of Torvathi domestic governance. The child is under his authority. "The child is in my bunk," Cade said, "with a compression splint and a Belgian Malinois." "A what?" "My dog." Vor's pupils contracted further. "Liaison Morrow, I must advise you that interfering in a Torvathi domestic matter would constitute a significant diplomatic incident. Your assignment here is observational." "I found a child with a broken arm in a storage bay. I rendered first aid. Those are my observations. Delegate Sorath will want the child returned. Delegate Sorath can come get it." Vor stared at him. Cade stared back. It was not a contest. Cade's face held all the emotional content of a concrete wall. "I will inform the delegate," Vor said, and his tone carried the particular Torvathi inflection that meant I am washing my hands of the consequences. Cade walked back to the human wing. Juno was still on the bunk, still pressed against the child's side. The child was asleep. Its breathing had stabilized. Its hand was still wrapped around Juno's ear, and Juno's chin was resting on its shoulder, and the picture they made together was something that Cade did not have a word for but recognized in the part of his chest that he generally kept sealed. He sat down on the floor across from the bunk, leaned his back against the wall and waited. He did not sleep. He had not slept through a watch since the incident on Kalsar Station 2 years ago, when a routine patrol had turned into something that wasn't routine and Juno had done what she was built to do, and afterward there had been paperwork and a citation and a conversation with a psychologist that Cade had ended by saying, "The dog is fine. I'm fine. Are we done?" They had been done. He checked his comm. The threat board was still amber. It had been amber since the Torvathi trade delegation from the Keth 4 border sector had reported increased pirate activity in the outer shipping lanes. The pirates were not Cade's problem. The amber board was not Cade's problem. His problem was 30 kilograms of Belgian Malinois and a small alien child with a broken arm, and the fact that somewhere on this station, a Torvathi delegate was about to discover that one of the quietest humans in the sector had just drawn a line. Delegate Reth Sorath arrived at 600 with 4 household guards. Cade had expected 2. The extra pair told him what he needed to know about Sorath's state of mind. Torvathi household guards were not military. They were status markers, ceremonial in most contexts, trained primarily in looking imposing. Sorath's guards looked imposing. They were tall, dark-scaled, armored in the lacquered plate that Torvathi upper caste favored, and they positioned themselves in the doorway of the human wing like they expected resistance. Sorath himself was broad, heavy-jawed, the charcoal scaling of age and rank. His eyes were small and steady. He wore the layered robes of a trade delegate, and he entered the human wing the way he entered a negotiation, leading with mass and silence. Cade was standing in front of his bunk. Juno was sitting beside him, pressed against his left leg. The child was awake behind them, sitting up on the bunk, its good arm around its knees. "Liaison Morrow," Sorath said. His voice was deep enough to feel in the floor plates. "You have something that belongs to me. I found a Torvathi juvenile in the storage bays with a fractured forelimb. I provided first aid. And you kept the child." "The child was scared. I gave it a safe place to sleep." Sorath's gaze moved past Cade to the bunk, to the child, to Juno. His expression did not change. "The animal, that is your service beast." "That's my dog. It is on the bed with my property." "Property?" Cade heard the word and filed it in the same cold, quiet place where he had filed the wrenched arm. She's keeping the child calm. I am not interested in the child's emotional state. I am interested in the return of my household member, immediately. Sareth took a step forward. Juno did not stand. She did not growl. She did not bare her teeth or flatten her ears or do any of the things that lesser animals did when they wanted to communicate threat. She shifted her weight forward by a fraction of an inch, and her gaze settled on Sareth, and her breathing did not change, and the temperature in the room dropped by a degree that had nothing to do with the environmental systems. Sareth stopped. It was involuntary. Cade saw it happen. The Torvath's hind foot had been mid-stride and it came down short, and his body rocked slightly and his eyes widened by the smallest margin. The household guards saw it too. One of them put his hand on the hilt of the ceremonial blade at his belt, and his hand stayed there, and he did not draw it. Juno sat, Juno breathed. Juno looked at the largest, most powerful Torvathi on the station with the calm, unblinking gaze of a species that had spent 40,000 years deciding which things in the world were threats and which things were furniture. Sareth, in that gaze, was furniture that had made a noise. Delegate Sareth, Cade said, who broke the child's arm. Silence. Because someone did. The injury pattern is torsional, grip and twist, applied to a juvenile whose bone density hasn't finished calcifying. That's not an accident. That's discipline applied to something too small to resist it. Sareth's jaw tightened. The scaling around his mouth plates whitened, a sign of compressed rage in the species. You overstep, human. My household discipline is a Torvathi matter, governed by Torvathi law, on a Torvathi station. Coalition Accord 7-4, Cade said. His voice did not change temperature. Section 12, Paragraph 9. Any coalition signatory species finding evidence of physical harm to a juvenile member of any other signatory species has standing obligation to secure the juvenile and report to coalition oversight. You signed that accord. Your government signed it. This station is in coalition space. Sareth looked at him. Cade looked back. Juno sat between them and looked at Sareth. The three of them formed a triangle that held more tension than every ceremonial blade in the room. You are citing law at me, Sareth said. I'm citing the law that keeps me from doing what I want to do, and doing what I'm supposed to do instead. Behind Cade on the bunk, the child made a small sound. It might have been a word. It might have been a name. Juno's ear rotated backward toward the sound, and the rest of her stayed perfectly still. The tip of her tail twitched once. Sareth saw the child looking at the dog, saw the child's hand reaching toward the animal, saw the dog's ear turn and the tail twitch, and on his face, something moved that was not anger. It was confusion. The child had been cowering when Sareth walked in. Now it was reaching toward a deathworld predator like the predator was the safest thing in the room. That animal, Sareth said slowly. It is from your planet. Yes. Your planet is class 12. 14 actually, they reclassified it. And the animal. Also from Earth, also a predator, also from a species that has been partnered with mine for longer than your civilization has had writing. Sareth looked at Juno again. Juno looked back. Her breathing was even. Her mouth was slightly open, the way it was when she was warm, and her tongue rested against her lower teeth, and she could have been napping in a sunbeam. She could have been lying on the floor of Cade's mother's kitchen back in Montana. She looked like she was thinking about nothing at all. Every experienced handler knew that look. It was the look the dog wore when it had already decided what it would do if the situation changed, and it was comfortable with that decision. And it was simply waiting to see whether the situation would oblige. I want the child returned, Sareth said, but the temperature in his voice had shifted. It had gone from command to request, and he had not intended the shift, and Cade watched him realize it. Coalition oversight will be here in 12 hours, Cade said. They'll assess the situation. If the child is safe, they'll return it to your household. If the child isn't safe, they'll place it in coalition protective custody. That's the law. I didn't write it. I just found the kid. Sareth stood very still. His guard stood very still. The room was quiet except for Juno's breathing and the distant hum of the station's environmental systems. Then the child spoke. Its voice was thin and clear in the silence. "The dog is warm," it said in accented common. "It does not hit." No one in the room moved. "It does not hit," the child said again, and touched Juno's ear, and Juno's tail beat once against the mattress, and Sareth's face did something that Cade had never seen a Torvathi face do. It cracked. Not anger, not threat display, not the rigid composure of rank and authority. It cracked like stone cracks, along a fault line that had been there for a long time, under pressure that had been building for a long time, and what showed through the crack was not anything Cade could have predicted. It was shame. Sareth turned and walked out. His guards followed. The door closed behind them. The room was quiet. Cade exhaled. He had not been aware that he was holding his breath. He sat down on the edge of the bunk, beside the child and the dog, and Juno leaned her head against his thigh, and the child leaned against Juno, and the three of them sat like that in the thin light of the human wing while the station turned slowly in the dark. The next 12 hours were not quiet. Sareth filed a formal protest with station administration at 6:30. Vor forwarded it to coalition oversight with a cover note that managed to simultaneously support and undermine Sareth's position, a feat of bureaucratic cowardice that Cade would have admired under different circumstances. The protest triggered an automated review chain that routed through 3 jurisdictions before landing on the desk of a coalition child welfare adjudicator named Hess, who was on a patrol cutter 18 hours out, and who responded within 40 minutes with a hold order that froze the child's custodial status pending investigation. Sareth filed a countermotion. Hess denied it. Sareth filed an appeal. The appeal went to a tribunal queue with a 6-day processing window. Cade read all of this on his comm while sitting on the floor of the human wing, his back against the wall, watching Juno teach the child a game. The game was this. Juno would drop her chew rope on the child's lap. The child would pick it up with its good hand and throw it. Juno would retrieve it, walk back, and drop it on the child's lap again. The child would throw it. Juno would retrieve it. The child would throw it. The repetition was the point. The predictability was the point. The fact that the 30-kilogram earth predator would do exactly the same thing every time, would not flinch, would not snap, would not change the rules, would not suddenly become something other than what it was, that was the point. The child threw the rope 16 times in the first hour. By the second hour, it was laughing. Cade had not heard a Torvathi child laugh before. It sounded like water running over stones. At 8:30, the station's senior trade attaché, a Torvathi named Kellen Moores, appeared at the human wing. Moores was a different kind of problem than Sareth. Where Sareth led with mass and authority, Moores was lean, sharp-scaled, the kind of bureaucrat who had survived 3 administrations by knowing exactly where every lever of power was and pulling none of them himself. He stood in the corridor and did not enter. "Liaison Morrow," Moores said, "this situation is creating difficulties." "I can imagine." Delegate Sareth controls the Trade Commission's budget allocations. Budget allocations determine this station's operational funding. Operational funding determines whether 430 Torvathi administrators continue to receive their salaries. You are aware of this chain. "I am." "Then you are aware that antagonizing Delegate Sareth is, functionally, antagonizing the station." Cade looked at Moores. Moores looked at Cade. Neither of them was under any illusion about what this conversation was. "Attaché Moores," Cade said, "are you asking me to return an injured child to the person who injured it?" Moores's scales tightened along his jaw. "I am asking you to consider the broader implications." I've considered them. The broader implications include a child with a broken arm and a dog that won't let anyone near her. I'm comfortable with those implications. Moores looked past Cade to where Kithara sat on the bunk, throwing the rope for Juno. The dog retrieved it, trotted back, dropped it on the child's lap. The child threw it again. The cycle repeated. The child was smiling. Moores watched for 3 full cycles, and something in his expression shifted from political calculation to something less certain. "The child seems," he said, and stopped. "Happy," Cade finished. "The word you're looking for is happy." Moores left without saying anything else. At 900, 3 of Sareth's household guards arrived with a formal demand for the child's immediate return, citing Torvathi domestic sovereignty and the delegate's parental authority. Cade read the demand, nodded, and said, "Coalition hold order. Talk to Adjudicator Hess." The guards did not leave. They stood in the corridor outside the human wing, arms folded, ceremonial blades visible, a statement of presence, an implied threat wrapped in the plausible deniability of "we are simply standing here." Cade closed the door. Juno lay down across the threshold, her nose against the base of the door, and went to sleep, or appeared to go to sleep. Her ears, even in rest, were rotated toward the corridor. Cade had seen her hold that posture for 9 hours during a siege on Khalsar Station, when the only thing between a corridor full of panicking evacuees and a sealed compartment was a dog that had decided the corridor was hers. She had not moved for 9 hours. She had not needed to. At 10:30, Pell brought food. She had assembled a tray of human rations and a separate plate of Torvathi nutritional supplements sourced from the station commissary. The child ate the supplements, then pointed at Cade's protein bar. "That's not rated for Torvathi biochemistry," Pell said. "It's a protein bar," Cade said. "It has capsaicin." Cade looked at the child. The child looked at the protein bar. Cade broke off a corner the size of his thumbnail and handed it over. The child ate it, considered, and its crest plates rose slightly. "Hot," the child said. "Yes," Cade said. "More?" "No." The child looked at Juno. Juno looked at the child. The child accepted the situation with the resignation of someone who understood that appeals to a higher authority were unlikely to succeed. At 1100, the guards in the corridor were joined by 2 more. 5 Torvathi household guards standing in a corridor outside a room occupied by 1 human, 1 dog, and 1 child. Cade did not open the door. He did not need to. He could hear them through the bulkhead, the low rumble of Torvathi voices, the click and shift of ceremonial armor. They were talking about the dog. He caught fragments through the metal: deathworld animal, unrestrained predator, class 14 biology. The handler is 1 man. The fragments assembled themselves into a picture that Cade recognized. They were afraid, not of him, of Juno. 5 armored Torvathi guards, each of them a head taller than Cade, each of them carrying a blade that could have opened him from collar to belt. And they were standing in a corridor talking themselves out of opening a door, because behind that door was a dog that had looked at their employer and made him stop. Cade scratched Juno behind the ear. She leaned into his hand and closed her eyes. Her tail moved once against the deck. "You're doing great," he told her. She sighed through her nose, she knew. At 11:45, Sareth came back. This time without guards. He stood in the doorway of the human wing, his robes disheveled, his scales carrying the dull sheen of sleeplessness. He looked at the child, who was sitting on the bunk with Juno's chew rope in its hand, and at Juno, who was lying on the floor with her head on Cade's boot, and at Cade, who was sitting in the desk chair reading a logistics manifest because the day's work did not stop for custody disputes. "Her name is Kithara," Sareth said. "She is 4 standard cycles old. She is my youngest." Cade set down the manifest. "I have 7 children, 4 from my first bonding, 3 from my second. Kithara is from my second. Her mother died during the station's fever outbreak last cycle. I have been raising her alone." Cade said nothing. Juno's ear rotated toward Sareth, then back. "Torvathi discipline is physical. It is how we teach our young. Boundaries are enforced through correction. This is how it has been done for longer than your species has existed." "Your species signed the coalition accords," Cade said, not unkindly. "The accords define harm to juveniles. What was done to Kithara's arm meets that definition." "I know what the accords say." Sareth's voice was rough. "I wrote amendments to 3 of them during my tenure." "Then you know what happens next." Sareth looked at his daughter. Kithara was watching Juno, who had lifted her head from Cade's boot and was looking at Sareth with the same calm, assessing gaze she had worn all morning. No threat, no warmth, just attention. The kind of attention that weighed everything and discarded nothing. "The animal," Sareth said, "she does not fear me." "She doesn't fear anything." "No, that is not what I mean. She does not fear me, and she does not fear Kithara, and she does not treat them as the same category. She lies between me and the child as though she understands the geometry." "She does understand the geometry." Sareth's head tilted. "How?" "Because she's been doing this for 40,000 years. Her species and mine. We didn't tame them. We grew up together. They learned to read us and we learned to read them, and the result is an animal that can walk into a room and sort every person in it by threat level before you can finish saying hello." "And her assessment of me." "You're not a threat to me. You are a threat to the child. She sorted that in about 4 seconds, which is why she's been between you and Kithara since you first walked in here." Sareth absorbed this in silence. Then he said, "I do not know how to raise a child without correction." "I'm not a parenting expert," Cade said. "I'm a dog handler." "And yet the child trusts the dog, and the dog trusts you, and I do not know what to do with that." Cade looked at Juno. Juno looked at Cade. In the 4 years they had worked together, they had cleared buildings, tracked fugitives, held corridors, and walked through things that Cade would never describe to anyone who hadn't been there. In all of that time, the foundation of everything they did was a single principle. The dog trusted the handler. The handler trusted the dog. The trust was not earned once and stored. It was earned every day, every command, every meal, every hand on the neck, every quiet word in a dark room. It was a living thing that required tending, and if you stopped tending it, it died, and once it died, no amount of obedience training could bring it back. "Delegate Sareth," Cade said. "When I got Juno, she was 11 months old and she bit me 3 times in the first week. Not because she was mean, because she was scared and she didn't know the rules and the only tool she had was her mouth. I didn't hit her. Not because hitting doesn't work. It works in the short term. The animal complies. It also learns that the handler is something to be feared. And a dog that fears its handler is a dog that will one day decide it has more to fear from compliance than from refusal. And on that day, you have a problem that no amount of hitting will solve." Sareth was still. "What I did," Cade said, "was show her the rules consistently, every time. The same response to the same behavior always. She bit me, I turned my back and walked away. No food, no attention, no engagement. The worst punishment a social predator can receive. 3 days later, she stopped biting. A week later, she was working off-leash. A month later, she would have walked through a wall for me. And she has, more than once, and she has never bitten me again." "You are comparing my daughter to your animal." "I'm comparing one scared young thing to another. The species doesn't matter. The principle is the same. Trust is built by consistency and safety. It is destroyed by pain. Once it's destroyed, you can sometimes rebuild it, but it takes longer and it costs more, and there's a scar that never fully heals." Sareth looked at Kithara. Kithara looked at Juno. Juno's tail beat once against the floor. The child smiled. "The coalition adjudicator will arrive in approximately 6 hours," Cade said. They'll assess the situation. If you want a different outcome than the one you're headed toward, the time to start is now. What would you have me do? Sit down, meet the dog. Let your daughter see you near the animal that she's decided is safe. Let her see that you can be near it without the animal changing its behavior toward you. Let her learn that the geometry can shift. Sareth stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he crossed the room and lowered himself to the floor slowly, the way large things move when they are trying not to disturb small ones. He sat cross-legged on the cold deck plates, 3 meters from the bunk, his robes pooling around him. He looked out of place. He looked like a trade delegate who had never in his life sat on a floor. Juno watched him. She lifted her head, looked at Cade. Cade gave her nothing. No command, no signal, no indication of what she should do. This was her read. This was what 40,000 years of coevolution had built. An animal that could look at a 2-meter Torvathi delegate sitting on a floor and decide, based on a calculus of posture and breathing, and scent and intention that no technology could replicate, whether the situation was safe. She stood up, walked across the room, and sat down 1 meter from Sareth. She looked at him. Her tail moved once. She yawned, her jaws opening wide enough to show every tooth she had, which was a display that Cade had seen make combat veterans take a step back. Sareth did not take a step back. He sat very still and looked at the teeth, and then at the eyes above them, which were soft and amber and completely calm. "She's showing me her weapons," Sareth said. "She's yawning, she's comfortable. In her species, that's a sign of trust." Sareth looked at the teeth again, looked at the calm eyes. Something moved behind his face in the deep architecture of instinct and recognition. Something old and biological, a predator's brain recognizing another predator's signal for the first time and discovering that the signal was not what it expected. "On my world," Sareth said, "the apex predators do not show trust. They show dominance or submission. There is no middle register. On mine there is. We built it. It took a long time and a lot of patience, and occasionally someone got bitten, but we built it, and the thing we built is sitting in front of you, and she is not going to hurt you, and she is not going to submit to you. She is going to treat you as an equal until you give her a reason not to." Sareth extended his hand slowly. Juno sniffed it. Her tail moved twice. She leaned her head forward and pressed the bridge of her nose against his scaled palm, and the contact lasted 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds on Sareth's face, something broke for the second time that day. He looked across the room at his daughter. Kithara was watching from the bunk, her good hand gripping the edge of the mattress, her pale scales catching the light. She was very still. She was watching her father touch the dog. "Kithara," Sareth said. His voice was different now, quieter, something stripped out of it. "Come here." The child did not move. Sareth swallowed. "Please." Cade had heard a lot of words in a lot of languages across a lot of deployments. He had heard commands, threats, pleas, and prayers. He had never heard a Torvathi say please. It was not a word that mapped cleanly onto their language. The closest approximation carried connotations of surrender, of yielding authority, of placing yourself below the person you addressed. For a trade delegate to say it to a 4-year-old child was an act of demolition so profound that Cade felt it in his sternum. Kithara climbed down from the bunk. She walked across the room, her broken arm cradled against her chest, her bare feet quiet on the deck plates. She stopped beside Juno. She looked at Sareth. She looked at the dog. She sat down between them. Juno laid her head on Kithara's knee. Kithara put her hand on Juno's ear. Sareth put his hand on Kithara's shoulder, the good one, gently, the way you touch something you are afraid of breaking further. The 3 of them sat on the floor of the human wing in a triangle that held a different kind of tension than the one from that morning. This one was fragile and new, and held together by nothing stronger than a dog's calm breathing. Cade watched from the desk chair. He did not speak. Some moments did not need a handler's voice. They needed silence and time, and the steady, patient presence of an animal that had been built, across millennia, for exactly this. The hours passed. Sareth did not leave. He sat on the floor beside Kithara and watched Juno perform the rope game, learning the rules by observation. The child threw. The dog retrieved. The child threw. The dog retrieved. Sareth watched the cycle repeat, and Cade could see him processing it, the bureaucrat's mind that had spent a career in trade negotiations now applying itself to a pattern far simpler and far more difficult than any trade agreement. The pattern of a relationship built on predictability. At one point, Kithara picked up the rope and held it out to Sareth. She did not speak. She just held it out, her small clawed hand extended, the braided rope dangling. Sareth took it. He looked at Juno. Juno looked at the rope. Her tail moved. Her gaze tracked from the rope to Sareth's face and back to the rope, and her entire body communicated a single, absolute message. Throw it. Sareth threw it, badly. It hit the far wall and bounced. Juno retrieved it, trotted back, and dropped it on Sareth's lap. He stared at it as though it were a document he had not been briefed on. Again, Kithara said. Sareth threw it again, better this time. Juno retrieved it, dropped it on his lap, he threw it. She retrieved it, he threw it, she retrieved it. And somewhere in the third or fourth cycle, Sareth's throwing arm loosened, and his posture changed, and the rigid formality of a Torvathi delegate dissolved into something that looked, from the desk chair, almost like a man playing with a dog. Kithara fell asleep against Sareth's side, and he did not move for 90 minutes, his back rigid against the wall, his legs losing circulation, because the child was sleeping and movement was not permitted. Juno spent those 90 minutes lying across both of them, her head on Sareth's thigh, her body along Kithara's legs. A bridge. A 30-kilogram Belgian Malinois bridge between a father who did not know how to be gentle and a daughter who had forgotten what gentle looked like. Coalition adjudicator Hess arrived at 1800. She was a compact, gray-haired woman with the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years navigating the intersection of alien jurisprudence and human stubbornness. She reviewed the medical records, interviewed Cade in the corridor, interviewed Pell in the logistics office, inspected the child's arm with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen injuries like this before, and did not waste time pretending otherwise. Then she asked to see the delegate. Sareth was in the human wing. He had not left. Hess entered the room, assessed the scene in 3 seconds, and said, "Delegate Sareth." "Adjudicator. I've reviewed the child's injuries. Under Coalition Accord 7-4, I have the authority to place her in protective custody." "I know." However, Hess paused, looked at the child sleeping against the delegate, looked at the dog lying across both of them, looked at Cade, who was still in the desk chair, still reading manifests, as if none of this concerned him. "I also have the authority to implement a supervised reintegration, conditional on the delegate's participation in a behavioral assessment program and ongoing monitoring by a qualified coalition representative stationed on Keth 4. Sareth looked up. "There is no qualified coalition child welfare representative on this station." "No," Hess said, "there isn't." She looked at Cade. "There is a security liaison with a service animal that seems to have formed a bond with the child." "That is not the same thing," Sareth said. "Delegate, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen a lot of things that are supposed to be the same as other things and aren't, and a lot of things that aren't supposed to be the same and are. What I see in this room is a child who is calmer than she's been in months, a father who is sitting on a floor he would normally consider beneath his station, and a dog that has done more effective mediation in 12 hours than most of my department manages in a fiscal year." Sareth looked at Juno. Juno looked at Sareth. She blinked once slowly, and then she laid her head back down on his thigh and closed her eyes. The gesture was so ordinary, so fundamentally an animal being comfortable, that its meaning landed harder than any argument Hess could have made. The deathworld predator was comfortable with him. Whatever Sareth had been an hour ago, Whatever he had been when he walked into this room with 4 guards and the word property on his tongue, the dog had decided he was something else now. And the dog, Cade knew, was not wrong. "I will accept the supervised reintegration," Sorath said. "Good. Liaison Morrow will serve as the on-site monitor. He and his dog will have unrestricted access to your household for the duration of the assessment period." "How long?" 12 standard weeks. Sorath's jaw tightened. Then he looked down at Kithara, asleep against his side, her hand still resting on Juno's ear even in sleep, and whatever protest had been forming behind his teeth dissolved before it reached his mouth. 12 weeks, he said. Hess nodded, made a note on her pad, and left. Pell followed her out. The door closed, the room was quiet. Cade set down his manifest and looked at Sorath. 12 weeks, Sorath said again. "You'll survive. Your dog is sleeping on me." "She does that. Is this also a sign of trust?" "No, that's a sign of laziness. She's a working dog, not a philosopher." Sorath's mouth moved. It took Cade a moment to recognize the expression. It was the Torvathi equivalent of a smile, rare enough that most xenobiologists had never documented one. "The child," Sorath said quietly, "she spoke to you. She said the dog does not hit." "She did. She has not spoken to me in 14 days. Cade said nothing. There was nothing to say. The fact sat in the room like a stone, and all 3 of them, man and alien and dog, sat around it and did not try to move it. The next morning, at 600, Cade took Juno for a walk on the station's upper deck. The upper deck was the closest thing Keth 4 had to open air. A wide observation gallery that ran the station's circumference, walled on one side by transparent composite panels that looked out on the star field and the distant blue arc of the gas giant that Keth 4 orbited. The light that came through the panels was thin but real, refracted starlight supplemented by the station's daylight emitters, and it fell on the deck plates in pale bands that shifted as the station rotated. Juno liked the upper deck. She liked the space, the light, the way the air moved differently up here where the environmental systems pushed a stronger current. She walked at heel beside Cade with her ears up and her nose working, cataloging the sense of the station the way she cataloged everything, methodically, without urgency. Sorath was waiting at the gallery entrance. Kithara was beside him, her splinted arm held carefully against her chest. She was wearing a smaller version of the Torvathi household robe, and she looked up at Cade, and then down at Juno, and her face did the thing that 4-year-olds' faces do when they see a dog. "Good morning," Cade said. "She said your dog's name 14 times during the night cycle," Sorath said. "I counted." Cade looked at Juno. Juno looked at Kithara. Her tail began its slow metronome. "Juno," Kithara said, 15th time. They walked, the 4 of them in a line that sorted itself without discussion. Cade in front, Juno at heel, Kithara beside Juno with her good hand resting on the dog's back, and Sorath behind them, his heavy footsteps measured and deliberate on the deck plates. They walked past observation windows that framed the gas giant's cloud bands in shades of amber and violet. They walked past a maintenance alcove where a Torvathi technician looked up from a wiring panel, saw the group, and stared. Kithara threw the chew rope. Juno retrieved it. Kithara threw it again. The rope arced through the pale light of the gallery, and Juno moved after it with the fluid, ground-eating stride that the breed was built for, and Kithara laughed her Water-over-Stones laugh, and the Torvathi technician watched the entire exchange with an expression that started at confusion and ended somewhere near wonder. They walked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, Kithara was riding on Sorath's shoulders, one hand on his crest plates for balance, the other holding the chew rope out for Juno to see. Juno walked beneath them, looking up at the rope with professional interest. Sorath's stride had changed. It was lighter. Something in the way he carried his weight had shifted, and Cade, who had spent 4 years reading the body language of one species and 10 years studying the body language of a dozen others, recognized the shift for what it was. He was carrying his daughter not because he had to, but because she had asked. And she had asked because, for the first time in 14 days, she was not afraid of him. The weeks passed. Cade documented them in the dry, factual language of a coalition security report, because that was his job. He documented the daily walks. He documented Kithara's arm healing. He documented the progressive reduction in flinch responses when Sareth entered a room. He documented the game of rope, which expanded to include a ball that Pell fabricated from packing material, and then a soft ring that the station's maintenance chief donated without being asked. He documented Juno's behavior, which was consistent, which was the point. The dog did not change. The dog was the fixed point around which everything else rotated, the constant against which every variable measured itself. He did not document the night in week 3 when Sareth came to the human wing at 200, sat on the floor across from Cade and said, "I hit her because my father hit me and his father hit him, and I did not know there was another way." Cade had looked at him in the dim light of the human wing. Sareth's scales were dull, the charcoal coloring muted by fatigue and something harder to name. He sat with his hands on his knees, palms down, the posture of a Torvathi who was presenting himself for judgment. "On my world," Sareth said, "strength is the first language. A parent who does not correct with force is a parent who has failed. The child learns the boundary through the cost of crossing it. It is efficient. It is clear. It is what I knew." "And Kithara learned the boundary," Cade said. "Kithara learned the boundary. She also learned not to speak. She also learned to hide in storage bays. She also learned that my hand means pain." Sareth's voice had gone flat, the way a Torvathi voice went when the emotions behind it were too large for the throat to carry. The boundary held. Everything else broke. Cade did not offer comfort. Comfort was not what Sareth had come for. He had come for the same thing Juno had come for on the first night she bit Cade, and Cade turned his back. He had come for someone who would not hit him and would not forgive him and would simply be there, consistent, while he worked through what consistency meant. "Tomorrow morning," Cade said, 600 the walk." Sareth nodded. He stood up, looked at Juno asleep on the bunk where Kithara was sleeping, and left without speaking again. He did not document the morning in week 5 when Kithara, her arm free of the splint, threw the ball with both hands for the first time and Juno caught it midair, and Sareth made a sound that Cade recognized as Torvathi for involuntary joy. It was a low, resonant hum that vibrated in his chest plates, and it startled Sareth himself. He looked at Cade as though his own body had betrayed him. "That sound," Cade said, "make it again." "I do not control it." "Good, the ones you don't control are the ones that matter." Week 6 was when the station's amber threat board turned red. The pirates that had been harassing the outer shipping lanes made their move at 300, a coordinated strike on 3 relay stations in the Keth sector. Keth 4 was not one of the targets, but the proximity triggered a full lockdown. Blast shields sealed the observation deck. Emergency lighting replaced the daylight emitters. The station's 430 Torvathi administrators transformed, in the space of 30 minutes, from bureaucrats into a population under siege protocol, herding into interior compartments, sealing corridors, and communicating in the clipped shorthand of a species that had survived enough threats to have a procedure for everything. Cade was in the human wing when the alert hit. Juno came off the bunk in one smooth motion, alert and oriented before Cade's feet hit the floor. Kithara woke and whimpered. She reached for Juno. Juno pressed against her side and did not move. Sareth came through the door 45 seconds later, his household guards flanking him. He was in full crisis mode, the heavy robes replaced by a delegate's duty harness, his scales tight with adrenaline. His eyes swept the room, found Kithara, found Juno, and some fraction of the tension in his posture eased. "The station is on lockdown," Soreth said. "Kithara stays in the interior block with the other dependents." "The interior block doesn't have Juno," Cade said. "The interior block has reinforced bulkheads and a sealed Atmo system. And 400 terrified people. Kithara's been doing well because the environment is controlled and predictable. You put her in a room full of panicking strangers, and she regresses." Soreth's jaw worked. He knew Cade was right. The 12 weeks had taught him things about his daughter that 12 years of Torvathi parenting traditions had not, and one of them was that Kithara did not respond to chaos the way Torvathi adults did. She did not go still and wait. She went silent and hid. "The human wing is not rated for siege protocol," Soreth said. "The human wing has a Belgian Malinois. That is not a security rating. Delegate, your daughter hasn't flinched at a loud noise in 3 weeks. She hasn't hidden in a storage bay since the first morning. She sleeps through the night. She talks. She laughs. All of that happened because one animal was consistent with her, every day without exception. You take her away from that animal right now in the middle of a crisis, and you teach her that safety is something that can be taken away. I've seen what that lesson does. It does not unteach." Soreth looked at Kithara. Kithara was sitting on the bunk with her arms around Juno's neck, her face pressed into the dog's fur. Juno sat perfectly still, her breathing slow and even, her ears tracking the sounds from the corridor. She was calm. She was always calm. That was the contract. "She stays here," Soreth said. "I am posting 2 guards." "She stays here," Cade agreed. "The guards can stand in the corridor. Juno doesn't need the help, but they're welcome to watch." The lockdown lasted 14 hours. The pirates hit 2 of the 3 target stations, were repelled by coalition patrol vessels at the 3rd, and scattered into the outer dark. Keth 4 was never directly threatened. But for 14 hours, the station hummed with the particular frequency of 430 people who were not sure whether they were going to die. And in the human wing, in the middle of all of it, a 4-year-old Torvathi child sat on a bunk with a Belgian Malinois and played the rope game. She threw the rope. Juno retrieved it. She threw it again. The emergency lights were red. The environmental system was running at reduced capacity. The distant sound of blast shields cycling open and closed punctuated the air like a slow, irregular heartbeat. And the dog brought the rope back, and the child threw it, and the dog brought it back, and the child threw it. At hour 8, Kithara fell asleep. Juno lay beside her and did not sleep. Her eyes tracked. Her ears rotated. Her body was a coiled instrument of attention housed in the shape of something ordinary, and Cade, who had watched her do this in situations considerably more dangerous than an alert status on a station that was not actually under attack, felt the thing he always felt when she went into working mode. Not pride exactly. Recognition. The recognition of one predator watching another do the thing it was made for, the thing it had been refined across 40,000 years to do, which was to hold a space and make it safe and allow nothing through the perimeter that had not been vetted by a nervous system older than civilization. At hour 12, Soreth came to the human wing. He stepped past his own guards, who had been standing in the corridor for 12 hours without complaint, and he stood in the doorway and looked at his daughter asleep with her face in a dog's fur, and the emergency lighting was red, and the station was still under lockdown, and nothing about the situation was safe, and his daughter was fine. She was fine because a 30-kilogram Earth predator had decided she was fine, and would continue to decide she was fine until someone gave it a reason to decide otherwise. And no one had, and no one would. "Liaison Morrow," Soreth said very quietly. Cade looked up from his calm. "I understand now," Soreth said. "About the dog, about the consistency, I understand what you meant." "What did I mean?" "You meant that trust is not a wall. It is a patrol. It must be walked every day or the perimeter fails." Cade looked at Juno. Juno did not look at him. She was watching the corridor beyond Sarath because that was where her attention was needed, and she did not waste attention on things that were already safe. "That's exactly what I meant," Cade said. He did not document the afternoon in Week 8 when a visiting Torvathi trade envoy from a neighboring sector watched Juno and Kithara walk the upper deck together and asked Sarath, "What is that animal?" And Sarath said, "That is a Belgian Malinois. It is from Earth. It is the most dangerous thing on this station, and my daughter is teaching it to fetch." The envoy had looked at Juno. Juno had looked at the envoy. The envoy's scales had gone pale. "It is also," Sarath added, "the safest thing on this station. The paradox is the point." The envoy had taken a step back when Juno turned her gaze on him. It was the same involuntary reaction that Sarath had shown on the first day, the biological override that every species seemed to have when confronted with an Earth predator's calm assessment. The envoy's guards had shifted, hands moving toward weapons that would have done nothing useful if the dog had decided the envoy was a problem, which she hadn't, because he wasn't. She had looked at him for 2 seconds, categorized him as furniture, and turned back to Kithara and the rope. "How," the envoy said, his voice thin, "how does a child touch that animal without fear?" "The child learned from the animal," Sarath said, "and I learned from both of them." Cade did not document any of this, because some things were not meant for reports. They were meant for the quiet space between a man and his dog, in the dark, at the end of a long watch, when the only sound was breathing, and the only truth was the one that mattered. 12 weeks later, when Cade's rotation ended and his transfer orders came through, Sarath stood in the docking bay with Kithara on his shoulders. The child's arm had healed. Her scales had darkened a shade, the way Torvathi children's scales did when they were growing well. She was holding a piece of braided rope in her good hand, and when she saw Juno, she held it up, and Juno's tail began to move. Cade knelt beside the dog and looked at the child. "Kithara, take care of your father." "He is learning," Kithara said, with the absolute authority of a 4-year-old who had decided that the universe was finally operating according to acceptable standards. "He is," Cade agreed. Sarath extended his hand. Cade shook it. The Torvathi's grip was careful, calibrated, the grip of someone who had spent 12 weeks learning that strength and gentleness were not opposites, but the same force applied at different temperatures. "Liaison Morrow," Sarath said, "on behalf of the Keth 4 Trade Commission and the Torvathi delegation, I am entering a formal recommendation that all coalition relay stations housing Torvathi families be assigned a human handler and a service animal of the breed you call Belgian Malinois." "That's a lot of dogs." "It is an insufficient number of dogs. I will also be recommending that the program be named." Sarath paused. He looked at Juno, who was sitting at heel, her ears forward, her breathing steady, her gaze on Kithara as though she had not yet finished the job and was simply changing her operational location. "The Juno Protocol." Cade looked at his dog looked at the child looked at the rope. The rope was the same rope from the first night, washed and rebraided by Sarath's own hands, because Kithara had refused a replacement. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He put his hand on Juno's head, and she leaned into his palm, and her tail beat once against the deck, and they walked through the docking bay and onto the transport. And behind them, a 4-year-old Torvathi child held up a piece of braided rope and waved goodbye with it until the airlock closed. The transport hummed. Juno lay down under the seat and put her chin on Cade's boot. Cade leaned his head back against the bulkhead and closed his eyes. Outside, the stars were cold and vast, and did not care about any of it. But in the narrow space between a man and his dog, in the warmth of fur against boot leather and the slow rhythm of breathing that had synchronized years ago and would not fall out of step for years to come, there was something that the stars, for all their vastness, had never managed to produce. It was small and ordinary and older than language. It did not need a name. It did not need a protocol. It needed only a hand on a warm head and a steady voice in a quiet room and the willingness to sit on a cold floor for as long as it took. Juno sighed. Cade's hand found her ear in the dark. The transport carried them forward into whatever came next, and neither of them was worried about it. They never were.